All right, the Senate will come back to order. Senate will return to order. I will ask the senator from the 42nd. I think she was finishing up her proposal on her amendment. However, I want to double check when she gets back in here. Senator from the 42nd. You wish to proceed?
Thank you, Mr. President. I had completed my remarks, colleagues. I just had not addressed the amendment, which just encourages congressional Republicans to back off their deep sixing of the bipartisan compromise immigration bill and move it forward in cooperation with Democrats and the White House. because it does strengthen our asylum process, create new shutdown authority, provide new funding, and combat fentanyl trafficking, which you'll see reflected here. It is the most conservative legislation to come about with regard to the border in many decades, and I think it would behoove the American people if that legislation was taken up. Thank you, Mr. President. If there are no questions, I'll yield the well.
No questions, Senator.
Thank you. I yield the well.
Senator from the 19th, did you? You want to go now? Huh? Hold on one second. You just told me before you wanted to go, but anyways. Okay. Senator from the 6th, you're on. Mm-hmm.
Colleagues, I rise this afternoon in opposition to SR 543 and to provide you with facts that you are likely not aware of given the wording of this resolution. Before I begin, I want to make one thing clear, and it won't come as a surprise to you, that this measure really does nothing more than seek headlines and not solutions. It's clear, based on the language in the resolution, that this is more about political points and not about securing our borders or solving our immigration crisis. In fact, as the senator from the 42nd explained, the majority's party has stopped every major effort to solve the immigration crisis in the last 30 years. Every single one. The last one being just last week, where former President Trump essentially stopped all progress on a bipartisan bill. So while I agree with the senator from the 51st that there's an impotence issue in DC, one of the causes is former President Trump. Now, I was originally going to spend most of my time talking about the great contribution of our immigrant community. But I thought about it some more and thought that it would be disrespectful to them to actually bring them up during this debate. Because the fact of the matter is that tying immigration to crime and fentanyl cannot be credibly backed up by any data. Any research that has been conducted has shown that there is no tie between the fentanyl crisis and immigration. And while blaming immigrants for this crisis grabs headlines, it's not rooted in pretty clear data. It's not factual. In fact, when you look at when the fentanyl crisis started, it actually started during the Trump administration, when drug overdoses for synthetic opioids increased over 192% during his presidency. That increase has slowed significantly during the Biden administration. In fact, studies show that the switch of drug traffickers to fentanyl in the first place was caused by the border shutdown that the Trump administration imposed during his administration. Similarly, I constantly hear about open borders. And while open borders are a concern, It's important to note that 93% of the fentanyl that is seized at the border is actually seized at ports of entry and at checkpoints, not at the border. And that's because, again, research shows that those refugees, those asylum seekers that are crossing the border outside of checkpoints, outside of points of entry, they know that they're going to get caught. So it would make no sense for them to carry any kind of drugs. It makes much more sense to try to smuggle it across the busy checkpoint or busy port of entry, which is why 93% of those fentanyl seizures happen at those locations. And when you look at who's being caught with fentanyl, 86% of those being caught at the border are actually U.S. citizens. Let me repeat that again. 86% of those being caught with fentanyl at the border are U.S. citizens, not those who are seeking refuge in this great country. Colleagues, no one wants drug and human trafficking across our border. And I look forward to advocating that Congress pass comprehensive policies that actually address those issues. But those solutions, those policies have been proposed time and time again, and there's only one party that has stopped that, and it's the majority's party. So if we want to get to work on a bipartisan solution, let's look for less headlines and look for more solutions. So, Mr. President, I encourage my colleagues to seek those solutions by voting no to SR 543. And with that, I'll take any questions.
You do have a couple questions. Senator from 27th.
Mr. President, Senator Yield.
Yes.
I believe you said that Republicans are the only party, perhaps you can clarify your comments, that has worked against or that is primarily responsible for immigration. My question is, do you support the repeal of Title 42?
No, Senator. What I support is a comprehensive solution that actually solves our immigration crisis. There's a reason that so many asylum seekers and refugees are actually trying to cross the border through places that are not checkpoints, they're not points of entry, and that's because our system is clogged. And there have been solutions that have been proposed time and time again that have been blocked in Congress by either a Republican majority or a Republican president.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
I'm asking specifically about Title 42, and it was President Biden who did not renew Title 42. I'm wondering, since Republicans, in your view, are the primary problem, can you help me understand why President Biden did not renew Title 42, which has been essential in ensuring that those asylum seekers that you mentioned don't disappear in this country into cities such as New York, California, Denver, LA, all of which have asked for reprieve from the federal government. Why did the leader of your party not renew a policy that was working so well under President Trump?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator. And I think the answer is that Biden wants a comprehensive solution that solves a crisis and not a Band-Aid. And what we have seen is that that repeal of Title 42 is nothing more than a Band-Aid. It doesn't solve the issues. And I know that you cited mostly urban centers, but the fact of the matter is that asylum seekers, refugees, they're going all over the country, they're going all over the state, including in red areas and blue areas. And those folks are not necessarily getting lost or trying to evade the system. And we can actually address that system by adding more resources, which this bipartisan bill in Congress that was ultimately rejected by President Trump and by Republicans at his order could have helped resolve.
Do you have for one last question?
Yes, sir.
The centers that I mentioned were the cities in which 5 mayors sent a letter to President Biden asking for resources. That's why I referenced those 5 specific cities, because they are the ones that have been in the headlines recently, really crying for help from a president, the leader of their party, ironically. My last question is, why is closing the border contingent on anything? Why don't we just close the border and then address the Ukraine, then address funding for Israel, then address any other H-1Bs or anything else? Why can't we just close the border today, which the president could do with an executive order, and then begin to work through subsequent steps to reform the immigration process?
Senator, it's quite simple. Closing the border doesn't solve the immigration crisis. Even with closing the border during the Trump administration, we still saw the number of border crossings continue. We still saw the number of immigrants waiting to enter this country explode, and that requires us to think further than just Band-Aid solutions. I'm all about root causes, and we have a broken immigration system that needs repair. It needs resources, it needs a bipartisan solution, and those have been proposed time and time again. And we need to come together around this because, as you know, we have an economic crisis in this country where we have too many jobs and not enough people to fill them. One of the primary ways to solve that is by fixing our immigration system.
Thank you.
Recognize the senator from the 36th.
Thank you, Mr. President. Does the senator yield?
Yes.
Senator, you are doubtless aware of a demonstration very close to home here in Georgia where the GOP stood firmly against bipartisan immigration reform. Isn't that true?
That's true. Yes, Senator.
And further, is it not true that former Senators Johnny Isakson and former Senator from Chambliss, Senator Chambliss, U.S. Senator Chambliss, U.S. Senator Isakson, came to the state GOP party convention, is it not true, and announced that they were working in a bipartisan way for a solution to our immigration issues and to reform that immigration system. Isn't that true?
Yes, Senator, I believe that is in fact true.
And in fact, is it not true that in the words of one of those senators, they were booed off the stage at the GOP party convention at the mention that they would work across the aisle under President Bush's attempt to reform our immigration system? And isn't it true that the party here in Georgia, the GOP, the majority party here in Georgia, booed off the stage their own duly elected U.S. senators when they dared to say, we are working on a bipartisan solution to immigration? Is that not true?
I don't doubt that, Senator, and we've seen a recent example of that when they threw several Republican U.S. senators under the bus who spent weeks and months negotiating a bipartisan solution and ultimately threw them under the bus and booed them off the national stage by rejecting a deal that was duly negotiated.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate your remarks. And in conclusion, isn't it true that if the GOP would get on board, we have the means now to do a bipartisan solution for immigration reform? That seems to be something that they're not willing to do.
Well, Senator, I think the biggest issue we have, and many of my colleagues in here, I think, are all on the same page about fixing our immigration crisis. Mm-hmm. I think the problem is, as the senator from the 51st, the majority leader mentioned, when it gets to the national politics,
that's right.
That's when things break down. And I think that if the folks in this room were in Washington trying to work through these solutions, we certainly get to a place of bipartisan agreement. It is my hope that we take that spirit beyond this chamber and actually come up with some solutions from D.C. all the way throughout the country.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator from the 9th.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, do you yield?
Yes.
Is it not true that President George W. Bush had a President Bush plan for comprehensive immigration reform?
That is my understanding. Yes, ma'am.
Right. And is it not true that this reform, it would call, the president calls on Congress to pass a comprehensive immigration reform that would secure our borders, enhance interior and worksite enforcement, create a temporary worker program, resolve without animosity and without amnesty the status of illegal immigrants already here, and promote assimilation into our society. Was that not what that policy was about? Is that not true?
That is correct.
Okay. Is it not also true that we are facing workforce challenges here in the United States and in Georgia, especially in our farm areas? Is that not true?
Yes, ma'am. It is true.
And is it not also, Senator, do you yield?
Yes, I continue.
Is it not true that maybe if we adopted some fair immigration policy along with stabilizing those countries that those that are crossing the border, and we're talking Mexico, the United States would kind of adopt some of those plans of stabilizing their economy, as well as immigration reform, that we could better solve the issue of the border crisis?
That is absolutely right. I mean, that's why we have to stop focusing on the Band-Aid solutions and really look at the comprehensive solutions that will get into the root causes of what's happening here. And unfortunately, we've let our politic get driven by divisiveness and by the extremes instead of coming to solutions by working the middle.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Mr. President, I yield the well.
Recognize the senator from the 7th.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to remind my colleagues that no human is illegal and to express my profound concern and opposition to this resolution. This isn't about championing border security, a goal we all share. No, this is a thinly veiled assault on any attempt to bring our immigration system into the 21st century, to secure our southern border in ways that are both effective and compassionate. Let us remember, there was a months-long bipartisan effort in the U.S. Senate to address our nation's immigration challenges. And these efforts acknowledged the complexity of immigration issues and presented potential solutions that, while not perfect, aim to secure the border while respecting the human dignity of people fleeing violence, hunger, and persecution. Yet these bipartisan efforts were undermined by Republican political maneuvering in the U.S. Senate by senators who have said they would rather withdraw their support for solutions at the border than give President Biden a potential win in an election year. Their actions prove once again that the Republican Party is not actually interested in addressing the problems at the border. Republicans continue to bluff and bluster but refuse to make any sincere efforts toward fixing our immigration system. This is proof positive of the GOP's fundamental hypocrisy with regard to fixing the so-called invasion at the southern border. The resolutions call for the reinstatement of previous border policies, and the construction of a border wall oversimplifies the issue and ignores the broader context of immigration in America. It disregards the positive contributions of immigrants to our society and economy, and the needs for a comprehensive approach to border security that respects human dignity. I urge my colleagues to consider the long-term implications of endorsing Senate Resolution 543. We should not revert to policies that sow division. Instead, we should commit to policies that reflect our nation's values of compassion, fairness, and justice. And we must work together to find solutions that ensure security while respecting the rights and dignity of all individuals. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. Senator from the 21st.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senators, I rise in support of Senate Resolution 543. I want to thank the senator from the 51st for bringing this much-needed resolution forward. Folks, the southern border is out of control. There really is no border policy. We're letting people pour over the border that are not being vetted, and these people are bringing drugs and crime to our country. And I'd even say they don't even like our country. They have no desire to assimilate into our country and be productive citizens of the United States. I want to thank Governor Kemp and the 15 other governors for going to the border to look at this crisis. It's not just touching Texas and the southern border. It's now touching every state in this country. I want to end by telling a story. I grew up in Louisiana, as you know, and in Louisiana you could get your driver's license at 15. And I remember my dad, I got a 1967 Mustang. I wish I still had that car. But I remember him telling me, he said, "Son, I want you to respect this vehicle. It could either kill you or it could kill somebody else on the road." He said, "I also want to tell you, if you get pulled over by a police officer, you roll down your window." These were roll-down windows, not automatic windows. You say, "Yes, sir." You say, "No, sir," to that police officer. You hand them your license. You come home, and then you'll have to deal with me. And I was taught to respect police officers. And I will tell you this, seeing what happened in New York City with these illegal immigrants, not legal immigrants, illegal immigrants, beating up those police officers, going to jail, getting out with no bail, and flipping us off the middle finger, that's flipping all of us off, is a disgrace. And I never thought, when my dad told me to respect police officers, I would see a day where police officers would be beaten up. It's a sad day for our country. I would like to also address the senator from the 6th who I have the utmost respect for. His party had control of the White House, the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. House, and nothing was done on immigration. He talks about headlines, that this is all about headlines. I would disagree. Let me tell you about headlines. Every time I turn on the TV news at night, even the liberal media is showing thousands and thousands of people crossing our border. Let's support this resolution and send a message along with Governor Kemp and these 15 other governors that this lack of border policy is unsustainable. Mr. President, I yield the well.
Recognize the senator from the 53rd.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to start with thanking the Majority Leader for this resolution. I want to thank the Majority Leader for this resolution. Probably one of the most sobering issues of our day. I'm the youngest senator in here by, I think, 5 years or something like that, but many of you have got gray hair. And I think you'll look back sometime on your legislative career, and this issue that this resolution addresses will come back as one of the most important. We've heard some debate from the other side that talk about fairness and justice. I'm all about fairness and justice. I'm a citizen of the state of Georgia. I'm a citizen of the United States of America. And we have sovereignty. Sovereignty for all of us as Americans. I keep hearing stories back home of how immigration has affected Northwest Georgia. I've talked about some of those with many of you when superintendents of my schools come to me and say, "What are we supposed to do with all of these illegal immigrants who are showing up at our school? The Supreme Court says we have to teach them. They've got a 4th grade reading level, but they're supposed to be in the 8th grade. There's no support from the state. There's no support from the federal government. Who pays for all that? The local taxpayer pays for all of that. Local ambulance driver, I was talking to a local mayor in town, fentanyl the other day. He was picking up a guy who was overdosing, put him in the back of the ambulance, and starts driving to Chattanooga to get to a hospital because we've got some certificate of need problems in our state, so we got to go to Chattanooga to go to the hospital. And his whole world starts closing in around him, the ambulance driver. And all he did was just touch the powder of the guy's hand. He had to be treated at the hospital just like the guy he was bringing in. It was fentanyl. The senator from the 6th said that there was no correlation between fentanyl and the human trafficking crisis. But just this past year, interstate cooperation, a committee once very irrelevant, we brought some relevance to it, had a committee hearing on the Texas border crisis. Brought in a sheriff from Goliad County, Texas, brought in a prosecutor, a judge, the former captain of intelligence of the Texas Department of Public Safety. And what he testified to is that in many cases, the cartel experiences no law enforcement friction until they're about 100 miles north in the border. That they will send migrant trains on one area of the ridge to cause distraction while they bring fentanyl across the other end of the ridge. The sheriff of Goliad County has a big sign planted up that says human traffickers aren't going to be welcomed, and he's had to take matters into his own hands. The judge of Terrell County, Texas, said last year in her testimony that her county ran out of money. The biggest expense was body bags. Because of the people who were coming across the border illegally, the men sometimes made it, but the women and children did not. And they would lay dead in ranchers' fields. She said our ambulance service, instead of going out and taking care of our citizens that may be having a heart attack, preventable things that they could save their life with, they're too busy having to deal with the crisis at the Texas border. This was a year ago that we heard this testimony. Now we see in the news, as this issue comes closer and closer to Georgia, that it is becoming our problem. To hear the testimony in this Senate today, we're just going to pass the buck up to D.C. They've got a bipartisan bill, they say. 5,000 people they're going to allow across the border in that bill. 60 Minutes come out with a publication just this past week, showed a man in California, he's got a few acres there at the end of the border fence. Nearly 3,000 Chinese a day are coming across. He was upset that they were burning his firewood. They were cutting down trees on his property. He comes out, shoots a rifle or a shotgun up in the air, and asks them to leave, don't damage his property. He was arrested and his gun was confiscated. At our Texas border crisis here, and we also had the Major General of the Georgia National Guard, a great and honorable man. But I asked the Major General, I said, is our Georgia National Guard in harm's way at the border? And he said, no, Senator, they do administrative work for the Border Patrol. Do intelligence operations and administrative work. And what are we figuring out today? We see videos constantly online of anybody who's looked of the illegals coming up to the border, and the first thing they ask for is Border Patrol. That's the first thing they ask for because they want to be arrested. But we've changed definitions very quickly with this new administration in our federal government. Words don't mean what they used to mean. When we got to the point of a recession, we just changed the definition of a recession because it fit the administration's agenda. Today, the media reports, when I went to the airport, that these people are documented. What is the definition of documented? They cross the border illegally, and then they are arrested. That's why they're seeking out Border Patrol, and that documentation is the notice to appear back in court. So now we call them documented as if they're okay. What I always find very funny is my friends on the Democratic side, they always want to point to fairness and justice. Well, is it fair and just to the citizens of Northwest Georgia to have to pay for something they've never asked for? When they signed on to government, they signed on to sovereignty protection, and they're not getting that. You know, one of the saddest realities of this crisis is the indentured servitude. Democrats champion themselves. They always point back and say, oh, if you Republicans were alive today, you would be in favor of slavery. Absolutely not. Because Democrats today, in my opinion, are helping foster slavery. Because many of these people from Central America, they can't afford to get across the border. So they become indentured servants to the cartel. What does that look like? You know, the Democrats used to say, oh, we're for the poor people. We love the poor people. Well, I'll put the GDP and the earned capita of Northwest Georgia up against about any of you in the inner city of Atlanta and the outskirts, and I'd say we're a pretty poor district. And I stand here in this Senate to stand for those poor people. Because when you're bringing in a whole class of indentured servants who are essentially working for free, essentially working for the mafia, the world's biggest mafia, the meanest, baddest mafia, as we learned in our interstate cooperation hearing, they have equipment equivalent to the U.S. military. You go down to Mexico and you ask people, what is the difference between the Mexican government and the cartel? They'll tell you it's synonymous, it's one and the same. I stand with Texas. Our governor says he stands with Texas. But I wish we were doing more for the state of Texas. I wish we were doing like the state of Florida and sending our resources there, because I have given up on Washington, D.C. I have given up on the partisan bickering about some deal. We are the state of Georgia. We have a sovereignty and a duty to protect our citizens. Why are we allowing indentured servitude in our state? Why are we allowing our citizens to be poisoned with fentanyl? One of the things we heard, too, in interstate cooperation was that the governor of Texas had a great opportunity to fix this problem when COVID happened. He shut down the border with any vehicles coming across for vehicle inspections. Because in order to stop this, if we're not going to have an executive branch in the United States to shut down the border, and he's got every means and law that says he can do that, we have to cost them more in legitimate goods than what they're making in illegitimate goods. The Texas governor shut down the border for 4 days. And why was it 4 days? Because after 4 days, the Chamber of Commerce started calling, we got to open this economy back up. So who are the big corporate people that are making all the money on this deal? How many airline tickets are being paid for federally to move these people from Atlanta to other parts of the country? You know, the Democrats say they're for the poor people, but they're just working for the big corporations by allowing this to continue. I think this is a great first step. I hope it gives more confidence to our governor to flex our Georgia sovereignty. I also hope that it gives confidence to our Attorney General that maybe he will sue the federal government for all of the expenses this crisis has cost our state. All the expenses in public safety, all the expenses in health care. How many more teachers have we had to hire, ESL teachers, English as a second language? How much more money have we had to spend just on Narcan? It's sad when law enforcement and EMS are now carrying Narcan for themselves and not just for the people they're supposed to protect. This is a great first step, Mr. President. I hope that our Government Oversight Committee, or maybe another committee, will start flexing its subpoena power in this chamber, because there's a lot of questions at our Atlanta airport that need answers. The media wants to call me a conspiracy theorist, and I think that'll age quite well once we start asking some questions into the Atlanta airport over how many illegals we have coming through today. You know, it all kind of stems from like the Stewart Detention Center. The reason why it's so bad, think about this. We've had enough illegals enter our state that it would make the 14th largest state now. 10,000 a day, some say more. That's like a Sanford Stadium a week coming in. They fill up the detention centers like in Lumpkin, and they have nowhere else to go but to push them out to the airports. Folks, it was a problem in Texas a year ago, 2 years ago. But the problem is here in our state now. Mr. President, I'll yield for any questions.
You have no questions, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from the 22nd.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be brief. I stand in opposition to this particular resolution, but I just want to point out some of the reasons why, because to some extent the resolution is schizophrenic. It doesn't really understand what it's standing with and what it's talking about, and it's confusing different things. So for instance, normally I would assume that the majority in this body, the majority party, would be in favor of arresting persons for drugs. But since this resolution talks about all the negative aspects of President Biden's administration and also talks about condemning the President of the United States, which I'll talk about in a minute, I must assume that this is basically somewhat of a negative resolution towards the administration. So therefore, I look at line 13, that 12 through 13 through 15, and it seems as though, because if you look at the overall gist of this particular resolution, it seems as though we're actually kind of saying that seizing fentanyl is bad. Because if you have a resolution where you actually are condemning somebody who's doing the seizing, because normally if you're seizing if you're seizing all this fentanyl, that means you're also making an arrest. So basically what you're doing is you're combining, you're saying on one level you're just comparing and contrasting, but based on the resolution itself being so negative, you really are kind of saying that seizing fentanyl and making all these arrests, because if you seize drugs, you actually arrested somebody too. They're just not sitting somewhere and you go seize them. So you're making an arrest. And we know that this is a good thing because of the fact that our own Attorney General has brought out many times where he has seized and arrested persons for drugs. We know for a fact that just recently in White County, there was a big story about seizing all these drugs and arresting persons. We also know for a fact that the Trump administration in 2020, when they seized all this 4,600 pounds, Kellyanne Conway, who you guys know, she bragged about it and said this shows how serious the president is about border enforcement because they had seized all this fentanyl. Well, heck, this must mean that President Biden is more than serious about border enforcement because he has seized and arrested all these people for fentanyl. So this is illogical. You make a negative aspect or negative resolution where your own president, my president too at the time, because I don't try to do all this division stuff, and I'll get to that in a second, but the President Trump actually says, hey, when we seized this fentanyl, this was a great thing. Did a press release from it. Also did something similar when they also did something similar in the Native American territories. They seized a lot of drugs there too. But you're actually trying to make this seem like it's almost a negative thing. Where the president that you were stolen today, he made it seem like it was a great thing. So if he took the border seriously, if his own press release said this shows we're taking border security seriously because we seized, 2,600, 4,600 pounds of fentanyl, whatever it may be, well, God dog it, President Biden must be really taking it serious because look at all the fentanyl and all the arrests that he's made for fentanyl. Illogical. Then you talk about Texas. Interesting. Do you really know what you're standing with? Because I would dare say that with Texas, you guys would say, not Texas necessarily, any other state, if they had lax drug laws, y'all would blame their lax drug laws on the increase in fentanyl. If they had lax drug laws, y'all would come up here and say, if they only had tougher drug laws like the state of Georgia, they wouldn't have all this problem with fentanyl. They wouldn't have all these people pushing fentanyl through their border. If they would only be tough like Georgia, they wouldn't have these issues. And persons have said they stand with Texas. Governor said he stands with Texas. I'm going to stand with him too. And that means when we start getting bills to try to change some of our drug laws in the state of Georgia, we need to stand with Texas and do what Texas has done. Because you see, in Texas, if you're charged with cocaine, it's called what's called a state jail felony. It's only basically 2 months to 6 months in jail. And if you are actually have your first felony, any kind of felony, is automatic probation. It must be probated. That's in Texas. Let me give you the code section for that. It's Texas Code 481.115. So you got to be pro-Betas. I'm going to stand with them too. And I want you guys to stand with them too. So when we try to do a bill, as I've done before, just to change the penalty for marijuana in the state of Georgia, let's all stand with Texas and say we're 100% in favor of it, because you're now saying you're standing with Texas. But I would say that you would argue if this was New Jersey or some other Democratic state, you would claim because they had these lax drug laws that this was the reason all this fentanyl was coming through their borders. But we'll stand with them. Let's talk about marijuana in Texas, for instance. Texas in marijuana, 2 ounces or less marijuana is a misdemeanor. As you know, in Georgia, over an ounce is a felony. In Texas, 2 ounces or less of marijuana is a misdemeanor. You only get 180 days confinement. Of course, in Georgia, you get up to a year. They got some lax drug laws in Texas, but you guys are standing with them. Let's roll with it. Heck, 4 ounces in Texas is a misdemeanor. 4 ounces in Georgia, I can't even get a bill to show if it's 1.5 ounces, it would be still a misdemeanor, because we so tough. And one of the reasons I've been told that is because if we be a little bit less penal on drug laws, then we'll have all these problems that would happen. But you guys stand with Texas. Y'all are good with these drug laws. This is what your resolution says. You stand with them. You ready to go forward. So please, no matter what arguments are brought forward after today, when we want to change the penalty, do not say you believe it increased crime, because you stand with Texas. So you don't believe that. And we start talking about the wall. Let's understand something. And this may make some persons on my side uncomfortable. But quite frankly, every president has actually built part of these walls. President Clinton built 14 miles of walls. President Bush did about 700 miles. And then President Obama actually did an additional 130 miles of wall. It's a different kind of wall, but it's still a wall. In fact, most of the wall that President Trump actually did was actually to fix the walls that were there. I believe he only did 87 new miles of wall that actually took place. I say that to say that there actually is a new article by the New York Times, I find it interesting, that says Biden, the border, and why a new wall is going up. He's actually increasing the wall by 20 miles, but you guys want to condemn him. So that's why I say this resolution is schizophrenic and illogical. Because even though President Biden is getting heat from his own side and saying, why are you doing this? He's actually increasing 20 miles to the wall. That's him. But you guys want to condemn him. And then that brings me to my last point. And you may go scurry on your phones and find some kind of resolution where President Trump was condemned or something that had no opportunity for passing. So I want to be real. Everything I said before this was also real, but this is very important. So whether my side did some resolution condemning President Trump for this or that, it wasn't going to pass. This will. Is this really where we want to be as a body? That we are condemning the President of the United States of America? Is this really where we stand now? That what we're going to pass, not what we just throw in resolutions that we know are not going to pass, not that. We all do politics. But do we really want to condemn the President of the United States of America? Are we that ingrained now in just politics for politics' sakes? And this resolution is politics for politics' sakes. Because in reality, he's very tough on the border, judging by the standards that even the Trump administration had, which was more arrests. He's doing more arrests. In reality, you guys don't believe in changing drug laws, but you claim you stand with Texas just because it's politically correct. But yet, if anybody in here, including myself, says, well, let's change the penalty for marijuana, you're going to come up and start talking about how to increase crime. But you supposedly stand with Texas. And in reality, even now, President Biden is actually increasing the border wall. Whether I agree or disagree with that is irrelevant. It's happening. And so this is nothing more than just a political document. But it's going to pass. And it's going to say what the Georgia State Senate believes. And I truly don't believe that you guys want to condemn the President of the United States of America. With that, I yield the will.
Thank you, Senator. Recognize the Senator from 37th.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, I want to talk to the folks in this room, and I also want to talk to everyday Georgians, because when we hear these claims about everybody coming together for these bipartisan solutions, we need to understand what we're really hearing. I come to this with a perspective of friends of mine who are immigrants who, of all the people I know, are most intense on immigration policy. They stood in line. They followed the process. They waited the years that it took to come into this country illegally, and they are outraged. They are outraged that any government of any party in this nation would look the other way and let the southern border be penetrated, not just by folks who want to come here for jobs, but who want to invade our country with illegal drugs, and as we may see in the coming years, I hope not, but we may see in coming years, terrorist activities. What the minority party here is telling us, when they say we should just come together and support a comprehensive solution, we need to understand, and I think the regular public understands, that when the Democratic Party in America says come together for comprehensive immigration reform, what they mean is amnesty for illegal immigrants who've broken our laws, who are in this country illegally. The deal with the Democratic Party in Washington for any comprehensive immigration reform is amnesty for folks whose first action in this country was to break our nation's laws. Not folks who stood in line, not folks who followed the process, but folks who showed a willingness to break our nation's laws as their first act here. That's part of the deal for immigration reform, is a de facto amnesty system, and that's why you hear again and again and again from Democrats in Washington and also here in Georgia, comprehensive immigration reform, come together, let's work in a bipartisan way, because the price for bipartisanship is amnesty for lawbreakers. The other price for a bipartisan deal, this comprehensive immigration reform, is fake security. Is this sense that a president who's shown a willingness to not secure our border will be given more powers, more singular powers to make those kinds of decisions, which he's proven time and time again. To my disappointment, not to my condemnation, but to my disappointment that he won't secure our border. I want to, Mr. President, as I start to wrap up what I'm going to say today, I do want to point something out that was very interesting to me that the Senator from the 6th raised in saying that 85% of the fentanyl that is seized at our borders is seized from United States citizens. Well, the reason it's seized from United States citizens is because United States citizens come through major crossing points trying to sneak it in normal vehicles and through the means of traditional commerce. That's why 85% is seized at our borders, because they're coming through these main points of entry. But the fact is, fentanyl that's never seized is pouring through our porous borders by illegals that are bringing it in, by gangs who have their they can go back and forth across the border, transport drugs in, and are never stopped because there's no enforcement of our borders outside of those main ports of entry. That's the issue we're talking about today. It's no surprise that 85% of the fentanyl that's seized is seized from American citizens, because but for our major border points, our border is not being safeguarded. No surprise. But the rhetoric here today, to look the other way, to try to push for an amnesty plan, is infuriating for regular Georgians who don't have a voice here in the Senate but for us to be able to call these things out. Mr. President, what we must do is we must secure our border physically. Whether it's the federal government or whether it's the states coming together, we must secure our border physically. We must reform our system procedurally. We must ensure that those who stand in line and follow the process are rewarded for that. We're a nation of immigrants. People who want to come here, we want to welcome them in, but they've got to follow the lawful, organized, fair process. We need to ensure that lawbreakers who come into this country illegally and are caught are never given citizenship. If you break the laws of our nation, you should never be given citizenship, so that we reward those who follow the process and stand in line. We don't reward those that break our laws. And last, Mr. President, we need to prosecute criminally those who come across our border, break our laws, and bring fentanyl and terror into the states and counties along our southern border and increasingly in other parts of our nation. What you're hearing in this discussion about comprehensive immigration reform and coming together is just a ruse. One party wants the crisis to continue, that they see political advantage to it, but regular citizens who are not party activists, but regular folks trying to work an hourly job, who don't want to see their wages depressed by illegals coming across the border and taking jobs and driving down wages, they recognize immigration reform matters. Families who can't afford to live in gated communities, who live in areas that are increasingly dangerous because gangs that have come across our southern border are perpetrating crimes across all of our metro counties, they care about immigration reform. and they depend on us to make it happen. If our president and our administration in Washington won't do it, our states have no choice but to do exactly that. Not for powerful interests, not for big businesses, but for single moms trying to keep the lights on in communities that are increasingly dangerous, that are racked by crime, racked by drug abuse, decreasing wages driven down by illegals coming across our border, competing for jobs in the underground economy, and that's not good for anybody. I come here today, Mr. President, to speak for folks in working class backgrounds who are immigrants themselves, who followed the process and did the right thing and need this state to act and support Senate Resolution 543. With that, Mr. President, yield the will.
Senators yielded. Recognize Senator from the 14th.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is a saying, it is attributed sometimes to the Buddha, sometimes to Nelson Mandela, and to 100 other inspiring people, but the saying is that holding on to a grudge or anger is like drinking poison and hoping that somebody else will die. Another version of it is holding on to a coal and hoping that somebody else gets burned. This body, and plenty of messaging across the country echoing some of what we're hearing from the majority today, is drinking a great deal of poison and hoping that somebody else will die. Cartels, who are the issue. I can admit, Democrats not afraid of the border. We just have what we think is smarter messaging on it. The cartels are a real problem. They're a problem in the governing halls of Mexico. They're also a problem at the border, where the security vacuum in some of these border communities, which is real, is giving the cartels the ability to terrorize ordinary people in Mexico and the United States, right? What is the border crisis? It is human trafficking, it is fentanyl. And it's important to be laser focused on the issues that do matter, that do find their way to Georgia in some cases. I mean, I could make fun of the governor for, putting on the all khaki suit and going out and acting serious on the Texas border, but the truth is there are some issues that come into Georgia's territory. I interned at the U.S. Attorney's Office, which handles a lot of federal human trafficking issues back in 2011, and Atlanta's a hub for human trafficking. People come here before they go up the coast, down the coast, right? So these are all very serious, real issues that we need to be taking seriously. What we shouldn't be doing is playing directly into the cartel's hands on our messaging. Cartels love anti-immigrant messaging. Why? There were only 3 senators in this room who were at the subcommittee that the senator from the 53rd were talking about. We sat there for 4 hours and we listened to voices from the border. I was one of the senators who was there. The other one can identify himself if he wants. But I was going to come up here and I was going to share a factoid that the senator from the 53rd has already shared. So I'm glad that he did. He shared with you a few minutes ago that the cartels will push immigrants, migrants, people across the border at one part of the ridge so that we are distracted from the fentanyl that moves at the other part of the ridge. Now, this is a practical, strategic problem. That's like a game of chess at the border that our law enforcement are playing. But I want us to reflect for a moment on the theme. What does that mean? It means that cartels know that our financial, political, military, police, media energy is so focused on human beings and the migrants that are crossing the border that we are missing the actual poison that comes across the border at a different place. For every message that is sent in this room or anywhere around the country that migrants, individual people, you're cold, you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, that those are the people bringing drugs and terrorism in the United States. Bow wow, like a monster truck rally or some crap. For every message that comes across like that, we are handing the cartels yet another win. Why? Because a few things happen like dominoes. 1, we are distracted from where the fentanyl actually flows across the border. 2, we are working ourselves up into a frenzy at the international level, and we're failing to do effective diplomacy because we're not partners with Mexico when we basically say that everybody coming from Mexico they're not sending us their best, right? Am I right? The third thing that it does is that it means we have more regressive policies at the border that we build political will for. And what do those regressive policies do? They increase the price of human trafficking. They make more money when they have to charge more, can charge more for people who want to get smuggled into the United States because, Title 42 was mentioned, we're turning every single person seeking asylum away on the pretext that we're doing it for COVID safety. So when you crack down, when you make the problem worse, when you demonize individual vulnerable human beings who are in many cases being trafficked, paying their life savings or their family's money that they can put together so that they can have a shot at being in this country, something, Statue of Liberty, right? When you demonize those people, you hand the cartels a moral and strategic victory. Now, that may not matter to anybody in here because it is an election year, but that's actually what's happening. So, both sides can play the bad faith accusation game. One party can stand up and say the other party just wants the problem to continue so that they can do their politics. I think we could both levy that accusation at the other party. But my question for you is very simple today. Which party's messaging is making the cartel's job easier for the cartels? And I would submit to you that it is not the minority party's messaging. Thank you, Mr. President.
Recognize the senator from the 16th.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate it, colleagues. It's interesting. I've traveled this past year. I've traveled out of the country, and every nation that I went into required a passport. They required me to go through their authorities and their figures. They just didn't let me walk in, and I don't know why. I understand why, because they care about their nation and about their country. And for us to allow people to come across the border without any documentation, not knowing who they are or what they are, is absolutely ludicrous. We've talked about crime. We've talked about drugs. Well, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about children. 85,000 undocumented children have come across the border thus far. 85,000 that we don't know where they are. We don't know what they're being used for and where they are. Let's add to that the cost to our schools when they come into our schools. That's added into that process. But here's the issue. We've talked about the cartels, but the cartels would rather have the children than the drugs, because the children can be used over and over and over and over again. The trafficking of children is absolutely an abomination, and we need to protect those children. Georgia is one of the #1 states for trafficking. We need to take attention to the trafficking that's going on, but especially to our children. If you've not seen the movie, I encourage you to see Sound of Freedom. It's about child sex trafficking. It is a real issue, and you and I need to deal with that. And this is a start. The one line from the movie is this: God's children are not for sale. And I believe we need to do everything we can to shut down the illegal trafficking of people, but especially of children. Thank you, Mr. President.
Recognize the senator from the 27th.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I'm aware that for about a third of you or 40% of you, the former president lives rent-free in your head and is the cause of all things, every single problem that's happening in America, even in the 4th year of the Biden presidency, is because of Donald Trump. But I gotta admit that I did not think, as I envisioned the way that this debate was going to go down, and we talked about the open border, and we talked about the surge at the open border, I didn't think y'all would blame Trump. But here we are. I remember when I was running for office back in 2017, former president was in office, and there was a lot of talk around the work that was going on at the border, and one of the key topics of the day certainly was border security, 287G program, another number of things that he was doing at the border. And the principle that I outlined at the time, the way that I thought about this, and the way that I talk about this, is that legal immigration enriches a culture, and illegal immigration impoverishes a culture or a nation. And I think that is what we're seeing before our very eyes. There's an old saying that when someone tells you who they are, believe them. And there was a moment in the 2020 Democrat primary debates, there was a moment of truth that for those that were listening, tipped the hand of President Biden and helps us understand how we arrive where we are today. And President Biden, in September of 2019, said, and I quote, "I would, in fact, make sure that there is. We immediately surge to the border all these people seeking asylum." That's exactly what happened. What we are seeing at the border is by design. President Biden dismantled the Remain in Mexico program. He dismantled ICE detention. He dismantled ICE priorities. There was even a member of y'all's party that wants to dismantle ICE. A member of your party was selling T-shirts as a fundraiser to dismantle ICE. So please don't come to this podium and have the intellectual, dare I say, dishonesty to say that the situation at the border today is because of Republicans. It's just not true. There's an institute called the Migration Policy Institute, a left-leaning pro-immigration institute. And if you want the truth about what's happening at the border and what the policies are that this administration has implemented, I would point you to their comments, and I quote, "The early Biden actions have, among other things, narrowed the scope of immigration enforcement in the United States interior, terminated most travel and visa restrictions imposed during the prior administration, extended humanitarian protections, made immigration benefits more accessible, and adopted something of a new approach to border enforcement. Biden also notably pledged his support for sweeping immigration legislation that includes legalization for the nation's estimated 11 million unauthorized immigrants," which what the senator from the 37th was referencing. The president's actions can be divided into two categories: those undoing Trump actions and those aimed at enacting his own new policies to make the immigration system more welcoming. I remember back during that 2020 campaign when the media, in an attempt to lie and defame the former president, talked about President Trump putting kids in cages, and there was a famous video that they ran at that time because we need to make President Trump look as inhumane as possible. The problem? The photo was from 2014. But it took weeks and weeks for the fact checkers to finally get around the idea of implementing it. I want to come back to President Biden's promise to immediately surge the border with those seeking asylum. And I have an image to show you graphically what it was that happened when President Biden took office. And I believe that image will be on the screen in just a second. You can't look at that and blame Donald Trump. We're going to go to the next image. This is ICE arrests. So you have spiking immigration, declining arrests at the border, both corresponding and both spiking in either direction during 2021. But y'all want to come to this podium and blame the open border on Donald Trump. Something else happened. There was a right-leaning I just call him a conservative president of Guatemala. And as we know, much of the migration that's happening is happening really all the way from South America, through Central America, up into Mexico, and to our border. And the Guatemalan president at the time was working with President Biden and his administration and basically trying to get help to close their border. And I'm going to quote the Guatemalan official. He said, quote, "We said to U.S. officials, quote, you have a large border with Mexico. We have a smaller border with Honduras and El Salvador. Help us close that one," unquote. And the article went on to say, but because the Biden administration declined the president's proposal, the Guatemalan official added, quote, "We could only assume that they wanted illegal immigration to continue." This president and this administration has not only signaled to Mexico, but signaled to every country in the world that they want the illegal immigration to continue. The president himself said, the senator from the 7th mentioned what we call an invasion. Do you know who else calls it an invasion? The former president of Guatemala. He said, quote, "What the United States has is a process of invasion." Who else is asking for help? Who else is recognizing this problem? In my questioning with the senator from the 6th, we mentioned this earlier. There was a lot of virtue signaling going on back in 2020 when the evil President Trump had locked the kids in cages, and we were showing the videos of when it was actually President Biden that had locked the kids in cages. And the virtue signaling was all the mayors of Democratic cities proclaiming themselves as sanctuary cities and talking about how they welcomed everyone. 5 mayors recently, one from my hometown of Chicago, mayor of Denver, mayor of Houston, mayor of LA, and mayor of New York City, all sent letters to President Biden asking for help. Because the reality is, sanctuary cities make for a pretty good campaign slogan when you are campaigning to the far left, but they don't work in reality. I want to quote Mayor Adams of New York. He says, "I'm going to tell you something, New Yorkers. Never in my life have I had a problem that I didn't see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy," and he repeated himself, "destroy New York City." I'm reminded on this issue of 2020. And in 2020, there was something similar that all of a sudden I noticed my Democrat colleagues kind of backed off from the far left and stopped advocating for some of the policies they had advocated for earlier. And that was after the mostly peaceful protests of the summer of 2020. We were in session during that summer. In fact, there were protests happening right outside in Liberty Plaza. Those actually were peaceful. But during the mostly peaceful protests that resulted in over $2 billion of property damage in America, most Democrat lawmakers were silent. They didn't dare speak up on that issue in a similar way that over the last 3 years, most Democrat lawmakers have been silent on immigration. And something happened. Don Lemon sent up the bat signal. He signaled to the left, the riots are no longer resonating. I want to read to you what he said at the time, speaking about that. He said, "It's showing up in the polling. It's showing up in the focus groups. It's the only thing right now that's sticking. The riots and the protests have become indistinguishable. I think this is a blind spot for Democrats. I think Democrats are ignoring the problem or hoping that it will go away. And it's not going to go away." Very similar, this problem of illegal immigration is not going to go away. The reason that all of a sudden the president is willing to negotiate with Republicans, the reason that all of a sudden the president who didn't visit the border for the first 2 years of his presidency cares is because it's showing up in the polling. Suddenly that surge at the border doesn't sound so good. But if this president was serious about stopping illegal immigration and closing the border, he would need to do one thing: say so. He could direct his agencies to shut down the border, but he won't do it because he and his party are not serious about ending the problem of illegal immigration. It's always tied to something else. Now it's tied to Israeli aid. We are tying the safety and the sovereignty of this nation, which could be fixed tomorrow, with sending aid to Israel. Mr. President, I urge the passing of this resolution. And I hope that in the days that come, in this being an election year, I know we will disagree on things, but I hope that we'll have the intellectual honesty to come to this podium and be honest about the problems and the sources of the problems that we have. And with that, I yield the will.
Senator's yielded. Senator from the 50th.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today I rise in favor of Senate Resolution 543. The number one responsibility of government is to execute the law and keep Americans safe. Joe Biden and the DC Dems have failed to live up to this responsibility, which is why we need to be united to defeat them, not working against ourselves. Because of failures in Washington, D.C., every state is now a border state. More than 8.5 million illegal immigrants have crossed the border since President Biden took office. Our governor has visited the border 5 times and spent time with our National Guard troops who are stationed there. The Georgia National Guard has maintained a continuous presence at the U.S. southern border since 2019. Under Governor Kemp, Georgia joined the American Governors Board Strike Task Force, which was formed to increase collaboration, improve intelligence, invest in analysis, combat human smuggling, and stop drug flow in our states. Governor Abbott and the state of Texas have Georgia's full support. States have a right of self-defense. With that, Mr. President, I'll yield the will.
Recognize Senator from 13.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I'm not here to slam President Biden, and I'm not here to support President Trump on this issue. What I'm here to do is point out something very simple as reality. There's not a one of you sitting in this room, there's not a one of the people in this Capitol that would allow someone to walk in your door at your home if you didn't know who they were. Not a one of you. You wouldn't just say, my door is open, anybody can come walk in. And that's what we're allowing to happen in our country. 9, 10 million, I don't know how many it is, are walking in our country, undocumented, freely to walk in our country, just as though they were walking in the door of your personal home. My God, when you see people that come to see you here for legislation, you want to know everything about them, who they are, where they're from, what they're talking about, what their position is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We want to know everything about them. We know nothing about these people coming in. A lot of people say, oh, it's going to be votes for Democrats. If that's the case, okay, fair enough. The point is, somebody's got to be documented. Something's got to be done. The issue and the problem is broke, and it's got to be fixed. And I'll reiterate to you one more time, not a one of you would allow someone to walk into your house that you didn't know. Mr. President, I yield the will.
All right, Senator has yielded. Does any other senator wish to speak for or against the measure? Chair hears none. So now we're at the point in time on this first resolution of the day. This is number 1 here, Senator. We got amendment number 1. Senator, Majority Leader, would you like to close the debate? Okay. Senator will close debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I did not bring this bill today to filibuster the entire day in the Senate chamber. But as I listened to all of the debate and the eloquent speeches from both sides, it became clear to me that we're probably not going to change our votes. Every Republican in this chamber will vote for this, I believe. And I believe every Democrat in this chamber will vote no, which I hope I'm wrong about. But one thing I do hope is that the people that are sitting up here in the gallery that have been in and out listening to this discussion, and the people back home who may be watching today or may watch in the future, will now have a better understanding of the two-party system in our country and the fact that we do disagree on things of this nature, and then they can decide where they stand on this topic. Now, we had some pretty exciting comments made today about political pandering and where we stand politically, and we're supporting President Trump or we're condemning President Biden. I want a solution to a problem. We come here at the state capitol of Georgia to find solutions to problems. Our Congress doesn't seem to be able to do that very often. And yes, this resolution condemns President Biden, and the whip's not here to hear this. He's the one that was talking about me condemning President Biden. We're condemning President Biden for the fact that he took back and did a reversal on what President Trump had put into law through executive order. We simply want that executive order reinstated. We want to close the borders. We want to stop the criminal activity. The senator from the 14th said we're making the cartel's job easier by closing the border. That's like opening prisons, Senator, and leaving the doors open and allowing the inmates to run in and out. We're making their jobs easier by closing the gates of the prison. I don't see that. The senator from the 7th talked about no human is illegal. Try that in Russia or China or other parts of the world trying to break into their country, saying that no human is illegal. I believe you will find resistance to that. The senator from the 9th talked about workforce development, how having an open border somehow solves the workforce shortage in our nation. I totally disagree with that for many, many reasons. We have policies in Washington that allow for immigrant workers to come to this country. In fact, we have senators in this chamber who utilize the H-2A program every year on their farms in South Georgia. We support those immigrants coming to our nation. We support people from other parts of the world coming to the U.S. to chase the American dream that we're blessed to have. But you need to do it in a legal fashion, and we need to have a process in Washington that allows that to occur. We don't see that in Washington today, senators, and that's what this resolution aims to accomplish, is to get our U.S. Congress to find a solution, shut down the border, stop the illegals coming across the southern border, support our governors that are begging for help. They're literally begging for help. We have mayors. The senator from the 27th brought out, the mayor of New York said this will not work, and it's not working. We have Democrat mayors all over the nation saying this cannot continue. We have to stop it. Senators, vote your conscience. I don't believe all of you believe some of the things that you were saying, because I heard you and I saw you, but I saw you reading text from your phones that someone else wrote. I believe you're repeating things that you don't believe. I believe some of you believe the same way we do, that we believe we need to stop the illegals from crossing the border. So when you mash your green button today, you're voting to protect America, plain and simple. With that, Mr. President, I'll yield the well and ask for you to vote for the future of our country, vote for law and order, and vote to secure our nation. Thank you, and I'll yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. Senator from the 6th, what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I need to read from my phone instructions. I ask for unanimous consent to excuse the senator from the 5th.
The 5th, the one that sits right beside you. All right, without objection, the senator from the 5th is excused. Okay. The question now is on amendment number 1. Is there objection to amendment number 1? Have an objection. On amendment number 1 from the senator from the 42nd. All those in favor of adoption of amendment number 1, of adoption of amendment number 1 will rise, stand, and be counted. Reverse. On the adoption number of the amendment number 1, the yeas are 12 and the nays are 31, and the amendment has failed. Is there objection to agreeing to the report of the committee which is favorable to the adoption of the resolution? Chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Is there objection to the main question being ordered? Chair hears none. The main question is ordered. Question is on the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor of vote yea. All opposed nay. Secretary will unlock the machines. While we're waiting on the vote, for those that might be interested in Senator Davenport, who, had a little mishap today, Secretary's office or my office can give you information about where she is and what her status is and everything. And we hope she'll be feeling better much and very quickly. So. On the adoption of the resolution, the yeas are 31 and the nays are 15. This resolution has received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore adopted. I recognize the majority leader for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I hate to do this, but I move that the Senate stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, February the 13th.
All right, the senator has moved that the Senate stand adjourned. Secretary, read the announcements.
The Transportation Committee will meet at 3 p.m. in Mez 1. The Health and Human Services Committee will meet at 3 p.m. in 450. The Finance Committee will meet at 4 p.m. in Mez 1. The Judiciary Committee will meet at 5 p.m. in 307 of the CLOB. And the Rules Committee will meet upon adjournment in 450. That completes the order, Mr. President.
Any other announcements? Any other announcements? All right, the majority leader has moved. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes clearly have it. We'll see y'all tomorrow.